Welcome to Raven Views the News. It's January 11th, 2011, and Adam and I would like to comment on the tragedy that occurred 3 days ago in Tucson, Arizona, where Jared Loughner attacked a number of people gathered outside a Safeway in Tucson who were participating in a event that Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was conducting, where civilians could come and speak with her as their representative in Congress. And she was shot. Judge Roll was killed. 5 others were killed, and many are still in the hospital. We're in a very interesting situation here at the Raven Foundation in that our mission is to educate people about the origins of violence in human desire. And so we find ourselves often commenting on tragic situations in the midst of very emotional times, and we are often come across maybe a little bit clinical or analytical in our take on these issues, but it's our concern, our mission about educating people about violence is born out of our own concern to end violence, to be sure things like this don't happen again. And I think that the whole nation is responding in a similar way to this situation, in a way that I think is a very, very positive thing, in that I myself really didn't know anything about Congresswoman Giffords or Judge Roll or the young 9-year-old Christina Green who was killed. But now I feel as if I know them, and I feel as if I have personally lost people in my life, and that ability to empathize, to make a connection across time, across distance, is really something very positive about the human spirit and the human species, if you will, that is something that we also like to talk about here at Raven, because it is that openness to one another that's both our strength and our weakness in many ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in what you've just described. And there's also a danger in that humans are meaning-seeking creatures. We're always trying to find meaning in events, both positive events and tragic events. What does this mean for us? And so we tell stories. We describe what happened, and we interpret what happened. This is part of what it means to be meaning-seeking creatures, and we try to understand what this event might mean for our lives. There are positive ways of telling the story, and there are dangerous ways of telling the stories, ways that lead towards healing, and also ways that might lead towards more chaos. And you see how this might be happening in our culture, these different ways of telling the story. Oftentimes in trying to find meaning in an event, we want to see who's to blame for this. Where can we lay blame for this? And you see this in people saying that it's the political rhetoric that's to cause the blame for all of this. You see this also in people trying to blame gun control issues. And when we blame people for these tragic events, it's a way of saying that we don't need to take responsibility for this in our culture. We can blame the politicians who have this violent rhetoric, and this is why this happens. We can blame gun control issues either way, and so it's not our responsibility. We can blame insane people and say that we have nothing to do with this. See, it's this guy who's insane, and he's the sole reason for all of this. And then we get to say that we're not responsible for it, that this violence is outside of ourselves, and we have nothing to do with it. Thus, we don't have to take responsibility to change a culture that's violent.
Well, yeah, and I think part of that urge to make sense of it comes from how uncomfortable we feel,
Yeah.
How frightened we are, how grief-stricken we are, and we want to get out of that place as fast as we can, and we also, I think, it's a very human thing to want to know that we're on the side that's right and good, that we're not like anyone who would do anything like that.
Right.
And so, and as Adam pointed out, all these different ways in which we're trying to decide who is the bad guy so we can know that we're the good guy. And it is a way fundamentally of avoiding responsibility, but it's an identity issue because it's a way of knowing that we're okay, that we're good, that we're compassionate. We're the one who would have, knocked the guy down and grabbed the clip. We're not the one who would have taken a gun into a crowd. We want to know that for sure. And so we set up these, in the aftermath of violence, we quickly run to a corner. We quickly set up a dividing line and we run to the good side of that line and locate ourselves there and take comfort in knowing that we figured out who's responsible and it's not us.
And the danger in that is that these differences that we create between us and them are just another excuse for us to act either with physical violence, verbal violence, or emotional violence, which always leads to more violence.
Well, and you see that so obviously in the political rhetoric where people on one side of the political spectrum are now blaming the other side of the political spectrum for incitement to violence, when now this blaming of them can be construed as an incitement as well to hatred at the very least.
The accusation is always a violent act.
It always is.
Which leads to more accusations and it unravels out of control. And yes, when politicians do this, it's easy for us to see and we become infected by that. But you see this in movies, you see this in music videos, you see this on the news, it's everywhere.
Right.
And how do you not become infected by that? I think that one of the answers is what Suzanne was getting at earlier when she was talking about this sense of community that we have throughout the nation when something tragic like this happens. It's a sense of identity, of being with one another as a community of sufferers. Everyone suffers. Nobody gets a free pass. And that's not to glorify suffering, but it's to say that at some fundamental level we're all the same. And even some insane guy who goes around shooting people is involved in this common humanity of suffering, of having, as you said, an identity over and against someone else that can lead him into this violent act. And we all have this identity of suffering together that can lead us into compassionate communities.
Right. It is kind of strange to think about what we know right now is very little information about the motivation of Loeffner. But what we're seeing, because of all these accusations flying around, is very little actual objective, rational search for what really happened. Yeah. And when we're engaged in these accusations, one of the ways you know that we're involved in a fruitless enterprise, a search for meaning that is itself meaningless, is that there really isn't any facts emerging. There's no concrete analysis of what happened. In fact, it's being obscured.
And you know what? Any answer that somebody would give is not going to be good enough. That's the problem with finding answers to these tragedies. It's not good enough. It's not going to make it so that it didn't happen. And so one of the only ways, or the only way, to get, for meaning to come into this is for us to come together, not over and against somebody, but to identify with our common humanity.
And to, right, because that, what we're talking about here is that search for difference, that search for how am I different than the bad guy, is the thing that gets us into trouble. In fact, it's interesting, I think, how people with mental illness often, to me, are sort of a concentrated, highly pinpointed example of some of the pathologies of the wider culture. Certainly, people who, what appears to be Loeffner's paranoia and search to know that he's good and who the bad guys are, is an odd representation of what we're talking about in one individual. And I think often the mentally ill can be mirrors for us, because I think they're ill, but they're sharply attuned to the messages they're receiving from the broader culture, as we all are. That's what makes us human. As we said at the beginning, is that openness to being influenced by one another.
Suzanne and I and the rest of us at Raven understand the need to make meaning out of the events of our lives. The problem when it comes to finding meaning in violence is that when we say that meaning can come out of this violent act, it will lead to a distinction between us and someone else, and that's just another justification for violence. And in order for us to heal as individuals, as a community, as a nation, we think that it would be best if we find meaning not in violence, but meaning in our common humanity. In understanding that, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, good and evil run down the middle of each and every one of us, and that's part of our common humanity. Another part is that we all suffer, and we all suffer together. And if we can band together in this humanity, in this common suffering, and comfort one another, then we will be led towards healing.
Especially the practice of comforting those we feel are the perpetrators, the ones who are responsible, the ones we're blaming. And that practice of not getting caught up in knowing who we are by knowing who we're not is the thing that we would say, we would urge that practice on all of us as we deal with the aftermath of the shooting.
So those are our thoughts on this tragic event, and we would love to hear yours.